We tell people that getting a prenup is like wearing a seatbelt. It's precaution, not prediction. It doesn't mean that you're planning to crash, just that you're protecting yourself in case you do.
Enough foreplay. Welcome to the F word.
Hey everyone, welcome to the F word. Today's an exciting day as we welcome our very first guest, Ian Steinberg. Now, Ian is an attorney who specializes in the legal side of love and money. He's a partner at, oh my God, I'm going to butcher this, Berkman, Botger, Newman, and Shine. Oh, okay. Where he focuses on everything from prenups and postnups to complex divorces and custody issues. He's been named a New York Super Lawyers Rising Star every year since 2021 and brings a rare combo of sharp negotiation skills and real empathy to a field that's often, well, emotionally loaded. Whether he's litigating in court, mediating a split, or helping couples put a prenup in place before they tie the knot, Ian's all about creating clarity so people can move forward with confidence. Welcome, Ian. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So excited. So let's jump into the good stuff. Prenups is a hot topic and one that I am recently very passionate about because we've been really helping couples figure out how to work as a money team. Obviously, the idea of whether or not you should merge your accounts comes up. And when it does, sometimes people make rational, irrational, emotionally charged decisions. And what I want to do today is really help everyone understand the benefits of a prenup for many people, especially when conversations about love and marriage are expected to be, romantic, idealistic, right? Till death do us part. Bringing up a legal contract in the context feels kind of like you're planning for failure, or at least preparing for it. And I think for a lot of people that can feel really jarring or just incredibly uncomfortable, or maybe even a little bit cynical. We tell people that getting a prenup is like wearing a seatbelt. It's precaution, not prediction. It doesn't mean that you're planning to crash, just that you're protecting yourself in case you do. So my question for you is, what would you say to someone who still feels like bringing up a prenup is inviting bad vibes into their relationship?
Well, look, I think it's important to note that while getting married, there certainly is a romantic element to it. Let's not take that away. But you're also entering into a business partnership, whether you think about it that way or not. And I know that's not the sexy way to look at it. It's not the romantic way to look at it. But at the end of the day, you are merging your finances together. You are coming to a business contract. And I think your seatbelt analogy is great. I often use something very similar. I say it's an insurance policy, right? You get car insurance, you don't expect to crash. You get home insurance, you hope your house doesn't catch on fire. We're not going into this by saying, okay, because I'm doing this, my marriage is going to fail. In fact, sometimes by having these types of money conversations up front before you get married may make for a stronger relationship because you go into it knowing how money is going to work between the two of you. And I think that is what's really important. No one goes into marriage knowing how divorce works unless you have a reason to. And I think that it's important because at the very least, you have important money conversations before you actually merge your money together.
Yeah, exactly. Because I guess I would say, even if you don't merge your money together, you kind of are still merging your money together, right? Like even if the accounts aren't merged, legally, you're still merged. Is that correct?
So I think you're alluding to one of the most common misconceptions. And
Great.
I practice in New York. And so at least in the state of New York, title does not matter. Now, what does that mean? That means when my friend asks me, well, we're married, but all the money's in my own account. I say, that's great. Your spouse is still entitled to half of that. Why? Because under the law, anything that you earn during the marriage, at least again in New York, is considered marital property. It's subject to division upon a divorce and typically an equal division. So just because it's in your name, it's about when you earned it as opposed to the title. And I think that's a misconception that people have all of the time. Oh, it's in my own account. Okay, doesn't matter. Did you earn it during the marriage? So that really is the question that I ask.
That's a great point. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that. So if you earn money before your marriage, and then when you earn money during your marriage?
Right. So there are two separate types of property, at least again in New York, for the purposes of family and divorce law. There's marital property and there's separate property. With the exception of a couple carve-outs, separate property is anything that you had prior to your marriage. So that's the cutoff point, or really the starting point for counting what's called marital property. Anything that you earn during the marriage is considered marital property. So it is about the income that when you are earning the income, as opposed to where the income is going, right? So I earn money from my job as a lawyer. It goes into my joint bank account. It's marital because it's joint. If I earn money from my work as a lawyer and it goes into an account in just my name, I'm married. It's half mine and it's half my wife's. So it doesn't matter that it is in a bank account in just my name because I earn the money during the marriage. And the same would go for everything that my wife earns.
Okay. So let's just take an example. Let's say I have $10,000 sitting in a checking account before I'm married. And then I get married, and that checking account, does it become marital property once I'm married, even though it was earned before my marriage?
No, because it was earned before your marriage, it's considered separate property. One of the
Okay.
suggestions that I give to most of my clients, if not all of them, is as soon as you get married, you should open a new bank account because it's very clear to make sure that everything you had from before your marriage is considered your separate property. It's clear. It's in the bank account ending in 1234. And then you open a new account, whether it's in joint names or not. Now it ends in 5678. That's your marital account. So it's really about that timing. Everything from before is your own. Everything after is going to be considered joint unless you have a prenup.
Okay. Now, talk to me about if that account with $10,000 gets money deposited into it. Like I earn from my job and money goes into that $10,000 account.
Well, now you've commingled your marital property with your separate property. And so most likely that entire account is going to be considered marital. The way that it works is now you go buy groceries out of that account. How do you know if you use the $10,000 from before the marriage or the $10,000 that you earned during the marriage that was deposited into that account? The answer is you don't. And so you've sort of lost that separate property nature, that separate property quality to that account. And so it's, again, why the suggestion is always start a brand new bank account and don't have that issue.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand it. If you have a premarital account and you bring it into your marriage, as soon as you deposit $1 into it, let's say, from a time you earned during the marriage, it essentially becomes really murky and now it could be considered marital property.
Right. Theoretically, if you never spent anything from that account ever, and that was the only deposit, you could parse it out. If it's just a regular checking account that isn't interest bearing, it's also maybe easy to parse out, but the word murky is one that certainly stands out. You make things a lot more challenging. And the second you start spending money out of that account, now you don't know which money was spent, the money from before the marriage or the money from after the marriage. And now murky is an understatement.
Okay. Clear. Crystal. People get so emotional about it though. When I had this one, it was years ago, but I had this one woman say to me, she was in front of her husband on a meeting. She was like, it was like $30,000. She's like, I just keep this in my separate account. And she was spending out of it and she was putting money into it. It wasn't like it was like she had brought it into the marriage and never ever touched it, never put $1 into it. It was just her account and she liked to keep it built up with tens of thousands of dollars. And she was like, my mom did the same thing. It's like flee in the middle of the night money. And it just stuck out to me because actually, let's tackle that. If she used that money to, God forbid, have to flee in the middle of the night, how would that be treated or seen?
Let's assume the whole account was marital or you couldn't tell that it was separate, right? Because without that assumption, theoretically, it's her separate property. while in New York, there are certain things called automatic orders that go into place when you start a divorce action. So you're not really allowed to just dispose of property. And by not really, I mean you're not allowed to just dispose of property. Essentially, what would happen in that situation is you would be able to see the bank account. You'd say, okay, there was $30,000 as of the date a divorce action was started, and her husband would be entitled to half of it. If she spent it all, then likely he'd have to get half from a different asset. And so essentially in a divorce, what you're doing is you're taking all of the assets that are marital and you're putting them on a spreadsheet and you're figuring out how they are getting divided. In New York, we call it equitable distribution, which means that things aren't always split up equally. That can account for having some separate property. It can account for certain things like businesses, which aren't always divided up equally. But for the most part, bank accounts, retirement accounts, investment accounts, those are really divided up 50-50. So she flees in the night with 30K. Okay, that means that her spouse is going to get 30K from a different asset. So that's all well and good that she has the emergency fund for herself, but it doesn't mean that she won't be responsible for paying back for half of that account.
That's really fascinating because I think that is a big misconception that if this money is separate, it's mine and I can do what I want with it. Let's talk about the role the state plays in what's considered marital versus separate property. Is it true that without a prenup, the default is whatever your state decides?
Yes, that is correct. In New York, you are guided by what the New York state laws are with regards to divorce. The domestic relations law is what we call it, and it deals with things like custody, like child support, like spousal support, and it also deals with equitable distribution, which is the dividing of your assets upon divorce. That is where you have the definitions of what's considered marital property, what's considered separate property, and the respective case law that has come in and talked about what the interpretation of those particular laws and how that determines how property would be divided in the event of a divorce. So when we're drafting a prenup, we are looking to what are the definitions of marital property, what are the definitions of separate property, and we actually specifically put them in the agreement, but we don't necessarily put what the state laws would say, because that's one of the benefits of having a prenup is you are guiding yourself within the bounds of the law, but you are getting to decide what is considered marital property, what is considered separate property, which is why oftentimes my first question to people when they are thinking about a prenup is, how do you want your income to be treated? Because typically under the law, marital property is anything that you earn during the marriage. But in a prenup, you can say that anything that you earn by way of income during the marriage will still be separate property, so long as it is in your own name. And that is why when you do a prenup, you are able to do, as we call it, either a tracks the law prenup or a title controls prenup, because you are able within this agreement to change what the law would otherwise say.
There's nothing more crappy than the state deciding what should happen to your money should things not work out. And so one way to think of a prenup is, should things not work out, I get to decide what happens to my money.
That's exactly right. You are saying we as a couple in advance are making a decision that this is how our assets are going to be divided in the event of a divorce. And so you are taking that decision essentially out of the hands of the state and instead making the decision for yourself.
Yeah, that is clear. Can you give me an example when the state default didn't align with what one of your clients assumed would happen?
So one example is when you're the owner of a business. If you start a business during the marriage, it's considered marital property.
That's wild.
I like to use the example of Joe's Pizza, right? I live in New York. I love pizza. Joe's is one of my favorite places. Let's assume that Joe, during his marriage, starts the pizza shop, and Joe's spouse is helping Joe at the beginning to taste the sauce and do the marketing for his first pizza shop, and actually works in the shop serving slices and maybe does some of the bookkeeping. And then ultimately, Joe's spouse takes a step back when she and Joe have kids and stays at home to take care of the kids. Now, under the law in New York State, in the event of a divorce, you would have to, one, value Joe's pizza business, and that asset is then divisible in the divorce. And also, obviously, then it was an income stream for Joe. So it impacts support, spousal support, child support. But ultimately, what you would have to do is determine what Joe, first, the value of the asset, and then determine Joe's wife's contributions to the business in order to determine what percentage of that asset she would be entitled to. So you look at both indirect and direct contributions. Indirect being staying home to take care of the children to allow Joe to continue to build Joe's Pizza into the empire that it is. And the direct contributions like tasting the sauce and working at the first restaurant. And ultimately you get up to a percentage that typically is less than 50, but with those types of direct and indirect can be something like 40%. We usually say somewhere between 10 to 40, 45, depending on what those contributions are. And that's something that in a prenup, if you know you're starting the business or you have just started the business, that at the very least you can figure out what the percentage would be. Is it 20%? Is it 25%? So in the event of a divorce, you're not fighting over what percentage this would be. And that's where there can be a lot of litigation because you have to prove your direct and indirect contributions. And part of the idea of a prenup is to minimize litigation. We put a lot of language in our prenups about what happens to real estate, jointly owned real estate, in the event of a divorce. The idea being so that we can make the process as seamless as possible in the event that there is a divorce.
That's incredible. It's hard because you may not know you're starting a business before you go into your marriage. And I think that brings up the next point of like, how much do you need to know about what you want in your prenup before you get one versus like, how much can you lean on your lawyer to help guide that conversation? Is that part of the role of your representation?
I think it's a big role of our representation. I mean, they call lawyers counselors for a reason because they're supposed to help counsel you. So at the very least, you know what you are waiving or you know what you are getting yourself into by entering into this marriage from a financial standpoint. And if we can set that up so that the two of you are comfortable with what you are doing financially before you get married, I think that is one of the big benefits of a prenup. Do you have to know what you want in advance? No, I think, again, very few people really know what happens upon a divorce when you're getting married. And so you're in a position where it is an educational aspect of it. It is learning.
Okay. Are prenups just for rich people? So there's a stereotype that prenups are usually pushed by the wealthier partner or their family. But I kind of want to know, is that always the case? Have you ever had a less wealthy partner initiate wanting a prenup? And if so, what are the reasons that, like, let's say the less wealthy partner might have in wanting to initiate a prenup?
So no, I don't think that they're just for rich people. I think that there's a few instances in which it makes sense for people to get a prenup. The first being, sure, if there is family money and people want to make sure that it is protected, that's a reason to have a prenup. If you own a business, that's a reason to have a prenup. If there's a large disparity in income, that may also be a reason to have a prenup. Oftentimes where we see either the less moneyed spouse or both of them together coming to us and say, hey, this is something that we want to do, often has to do with when they do want to keep their income separate, because there really is no way to keep your income earned during the marriage as separate property without a prenup. And so I think that is an opportunity for a couple together to come and say, I'd like to get a prenup. Another situation that can occur is that there are possibilities for the person who is the less moneyed spouse to do better, quote unquote, with a prenup than they would under the law. There are certain concessions that maybe under the law you don't necessarily have, But hey, you want to protect something, maybe you got to give me something in exchange. And
Let's
so
talk more about that. What are some of the details there?
So for instance, you have someone who wants to protect the business, right? And so perhaps they want to say that I started this business before the marriage, and I understand that some of the appreciation of the business may take place during the marriage, which would make that appreciation marital property. Because again, we're talking about the time in which money was earned, the value was created. If it goes from $1 million before the marriage to a $10 million company, you have $9 million of marital property that was created during the marriage. So if one soon-to-be spouse wants to protect that interest, maybe there's something else that they give. Do they give a higher amount of spousal support than maybe they would otherwise have to give? Do they agree to purchase a home in joint names that their spouse may be entitled to upon a divorce? And I think that there's an opportunity a bit for negotiation when you're going through this process. Now, to me, it's supposed to be amicable. I handle prenups, I handle divorces. They're handled very differently. One, you have a couple who's coming together, and the other, you have a couple who's separating. And so you're coming to it from an idea, from a place of wanting to build a relationship together. So let's not fight before we even get married.
I want to get into another example around what you were saying about how someone who is the less moneyed person coming into a relationship might actually want a prenup, because if their circumstances were to change favorably, they would want to have that foresight to protect themselves that they wouldn't have otherwise under the law. So a business is one case, but let's talk about a caregiver case, right? I think family planning is something that people often don't think about as a really good reason to have a prenup conversation. Let's say one partner plans to step back in their career for childcare or elder care. How can a prenup acknowledge and protect the value of that person who is going to be less moneyed, or support in the value of like unpaid labor?
So to start, I think it's important to note that one thing that we can't talk about in prenups is anything child related, meaning we can't talk about child support and we can't talk about child custody, at least here in New York. The idea being that in the event of a divorce, the court wants to be able to do what's in the best interest of the child or the children at the time. However, we can condition things on there being children. So in many agreements, I'm faced with the situation in which you said, and a couple knows in advance, okay, mom is going to step back, or the wife to be is going to step back, or the husband to be is going to step back once there are children. And I think that in that instance, we can say, okay, there will be spousal support paid in the event one spouse steps back to take care of children and works less than X amount of hours per year, or whatever the case may be, to account for the fact that they aren't going to be working. And that's a family decision. That's a decision that they are making together. They know they're going to make that decision. So let's account for it now. I think a lot of times in that instance, there's a question as to whether the income earned during the marriage is going to be marital or separate. Because if it's going to be separate and one spouse is stepping back, well, we have to find a way to compensate. Is that a lump sum payment from the spouse who continue to work to the other spouse in the event of a divorce? Is it a housing provision where the spouse who continue to work will have to pay the other spouse a certain amount for housing, or provide a home, whether that's a rental home or that is a home that is purchased? There are a bunch of ways that we can account for that situation if we know. If the money earned during the marriage is going to be considered marital property, well, then the other spouse is likely entitled to half of it, whether he or she is working or is staying home to take care of the kids. And so maybe less of those additional provisions or clauses are really needed to account for that.
So depending on how they want to treat the earned income during marriage, a prenup could help to clarify and ensure that the person who is stepping back to be a caregiver isn't punished financially.
That's exactly right.
That's important because more and more we're seeing dual income households and both parents are staying in the workforce. But in a situation where you know in advance that that's going to happen. It's almost a necessity to go ahead and just plan that out up front. Again, like we said in the case, not because we're planning for it, we're prepared should something change.
Right. And when you are going through all of your planning, whether that's doing your will, whether that's planning the wedding, whether that's planning for what would happen in the event of a divorce, you want to make sure that you're prepared. And if you know that your situation is, I know I'm going to step back and stop working once we get married because we're going to try and have children. And when we do, I know that I'm going to stay home to take care of the kids. Why not account for that now? And sure, not everyone knows how it's going to go or what's going to transpire. Unfortunately, a line I use a lot is that I have to live in your worst case scenario or your worst nightmare, because I want to make sure that in the event the unthinkable happens and you do get a divorce, you're protected, or at the very least, you know what things would look like in that instance.
You know, one thing I try to encourage couples to think about with regards to a prenup is that it's showing that you can have a hard conversation and be there for one another when you're at the height of your love, right? It's you getting to say what you'd want to happen to the person you love should something change, right? Because life is unpredictable. And so instead of looking at it as a way to assume we're going down a bad path, it's more like, should things take a turn, I want you to be taken care of. And that is so important to me that I'm going to plan for it regardless. What do you think about that sentiment?
I think it's spot on. And you're planning so many other parts of your life. You plan where to live, you plan where you're going to work, you plan whether or not you're going to have kids. This is another part of the plan. You should be working together on it. So if you know how that is going to go, or know how you would like it to go, why not talk about it now? It's hard. It's a hard conversation to have. It's hard to think about going dress shopping and then picking out the flowers and then talking about what would happen if all of that hoopla is for naught. But again, the idea is that hopefully in the event that does happen, you can get divorced in a way that has some dignity to it and that follows the way you wanted things to go, at least in terms of the way your assets will be split.
Yeah. I want to talk about the fact that money has a transactional nature to it, right? So when you bring this transactional feeling into a romantic relationship, especially at the time, around the time of your engagement, where the vibe is supposed to be, I'd cross to the ends of the earth for you, I think it can suddenly feel like you're inserting like a contractual conversation into what's supposed to be pure Disney love. Do you help couples navigate that emotional shift? Because it can feel so transactional to talk about it at a time that things are hyper romantic.
No, it's true. But sometimes what I say is, did you go get your marriage license yet? And people say, yes. And so I say, okay, so you signed something that says you're going to get married. That's a contract, right? And so there, as much as there is the walking down the aisle, the first dance, the love element of it, this is also a business transaction. And it's hard to shift, to your point, into that mindset because it doesn't feel that way. Everything about the relationship is emotional. It's about building a life together, but part of building a life together is building a financial life together. And I think getting your ducks in a row and having that hard conversation about what your finances are going to look like sometimes can help you because you've talked about it. You've put your cards out on the table, and each of you have had those conversations about money that sometimes people never have in a relationship or in a marriage. And so to have that before you say I do, I think it hopefully could help you build a stronger relationship because at least you're having hard conversations. You're able to get through those hard conversations, come to our office, sign the document, put it in a drawer, and hopefully never see it again.
Yeah. If anything, it should make you guys closer to show how much you care about one another and want to protect one another. Instead of tainting the relationship, you're actually strengthening it. So in a way, a prenup doesn't cheapen the romance. It shows you're willing to have hard conversations, honest conversations, and that's not transactional at all. That's, in fact, could be quite transformational for your relationship.
Completely agree.
You know, some couples feel like they don't have enough to justify a prenup. What would you say to that? What about student debt? We talked a little bit about the person stepping back to be maybe a caretaker or an elder caretaker, but what about the other things in your partner's profile that might be a little bit scary, like their student debt? How does a prenup prevent one partner from taking on the other person's liabilities? Can it help in that? That it's not just about the money, the assets, it's also about the liabilities.
Yes, I think it's a misconception to think that a prenup is only for the super wealthy and that the only topics people can cover in a prenup are what happens to the millions and trillions of dollars that people have before they get married or that they earn during the marriage. There's a lot of other things that we can talk about. To your point, what happens with debts, right? What we do is we make sure that each soon-to-be spouse has a list of assets and liabilities that they put at the back of the agreement. So A, it helps you be very clear about what you have now, what's your separate property that you have coming into the marriage, and then B, what those debts are that you have. And you can decide how you want to deal with those debts in whatever manner feels best for you. Is that you came in with the debts during the marriage, they remain your separate debt? Is it that you're allowed to use the money that you earned during the marriage to pay down those debts? Would there be a credit back for that in the event that there is a divorce? I think there's just a lot of optionality which is created in terms of how you are going to govern your financial lives that you as a couple have the control over when you are engaging in drafting a prenup versus leaving it up to what the law would otherwise say. You can craft the agreement in a manner that works for the two of you.
So prenups are not just for asset protection, they can also prevent you from inheriting your partner's debt.
If that's what you want them to say, you certainly can.
Yeah. So on that note, could you just write that stuff out without a lawyer? How does it hold up? Could you and your partner just write it down on a piece of paper, sign it, fingerprint it? Would that work?
Not really. There are certain requirements that are needed when you're drafting a prenup. So for instance, if you're dealing with spousal support, there's particular language that needs to be included. You need to cite to the statute. You need to put in what the calculations would be. Otherwise, you can't really waive it unless you know what rights you were waived. It needs to be certain language about the fact that this is an agreement pursuant to the domestic relations law. All of that lawyer legalese stuff that people usually just leave to us and gloss over in the agreement, but that needs to be there for it to be a valid agreement. In terms of enforceability, one of the first things that we talk about is that each side does need to be represented by counsel. Usually that actually benefits the person who is seeking the prenup because they want to make sure that when they go to enforce it, they can say, look, my spouse was represented by counsel. They knew what they were doing when they were entering into this agreement. There was no fraud. There was no duress. There was none of those things that may make the agreement challengeable. We talk about timing a lot. How far before the wedding do you need to have it? Typically, we say 6 months in advance is a really good time to start thinking about it. Ideally, that gives enough time to have the conversations with whatever attorney is representing you, to have the conversations with your fiance, to allow the lawyers to have conversations and to not feel like you are in the shadow of the altar. Even when both sides are represented by lawyers, if we are signing it close and it's been negotiated for months and months, if the couple's signing it very close to the wedding, we will put something in that says this has been the product of negotiation over a series of months while with each side represented by counsel, to be very clear that this, even though it was signed Friday before you go to your rehearsal dinner, it wasn't just shown to you right before. It had been well thought out and well discussed.
Sure. Makes sense. So as far as when a couple should start the prenup conversation, it sounds like the earlier the better. You can lean on your counsel to help guide the conversation so that you make sure to address all the things. Because like someone coming into the first time may not know all the things to think about, and that's where you really leverage your representation.
Exactly. When you have the opportunity to really learn about this, and you can then think about what you want and what you as a couple want in terms of how you're going to govern your financial lives. If you're just making that decision on a whim, that may leave you in a worse place than you were before had you not had the appropriate time to really think this through.
Okay. Can you give us a ballpark of what someone might expect to pay for a prenup, both in time and money? Like, will a prenup cost you less if you have $10,000 versus $1 million? Is it based on your net worth or is it based on something else?
It is not based on your net worth, right?
Okay.
The agreement is really about how complicated are your current assets? How complicated do you think your assets are going to be? Typically, if there's something like a business, there may be more negotiation about the business. There may be more drafting about how that would look. So perhaps that's a reason why things may take more time and thus be more expensive. But if what you're doing is tracking the law and you just want to be really clear what was your separate property from before, it doesn't matter really if that separate property is $100,000 or it's $5 million in terms of the drafting of the agreement. The concepts are really the same.
That's helpful. It's like the more complex, the more negotiating time or the more complex, the more legalese is required. So it's really about the negotiation and the language and the time it takes to put that in place.
Yes, and that has to do with the complexity of the assets that you have and what you're doing with those assets. You could have the most complex assets in the world and say everything I have is going to, in my name, is going to be my separate property, and everything you have your name is going to be your separate property, and only what we put in joint names will be considered marital property. That's not the most complicated prenuptial agreement to draft up because it's pretty clear what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. But if you start to get into a little bit more detail on what happens, is there a business? Is there a percentage that you're automatically assigning to the non-titled spouse? Are there homes involved? How are we going to sell those homes or buy out the other one of those homes? So it's a little bit more in terms of the complication of assets ultimately leads to probably more negotiation, more conversation about it, which then translates to more lawyer time spent both on those negotiations and those conversations, but also the drafting of it to make sure that the drafting matches your intention. And so ultimately, that's where things can get slightly more expensive. We're not talking about crazy amounts of money when ultimately, if you're looking to protect something, you're probably looking to protect a lot more than what you're spending in legal fees for a prenup.
Okay, makes sense. A quick thought on postnups. What is the difference?
So a prenup is pre-nuptial, so before you get married, and a postnup is post-nuptial, so after you've gotten married. In terms of the content of the agreements, they're pretty similar. You talk about the same things. You're still defining what is marital property, what's separate property. You still can talk about spousal support. You still cannot talk about child support and child custody. They are very similar in terms of the agreements themselves. There's just a different mindset because you're either married and so something is changing in that marriage, or there's a reason why somebody wants to have that postnup. Are they starting a business? Did someone lose a lot of money gambling? And sometimes it's just we didn't get a chance to finish it right before the marriage. So instead of ruining the last week before you get married, dealing with lawyers and prenups, we just waited a little bit. If you want someone to sign an agreement and then you get married to them anyway, now you're married. So they don't necessarily have to sign that agreement because that leverage, so to speak, isn't of I won't marry you if you don't sign this, isn't really there anymore. But on the flip side, that also means that there's less concern about was this signed with duress, was this signed too close to the marriage, because now you're already married and you nonetheless signed the agreement.
Very true. Okay, so a postnup is just a prenup that's written after marriage for the most part.
I guess I could have said that in a few less words.
I wanted to know what are some of the wildest things you've seen put. Just give me like one or two juicy good things that you saw someone put into a prenup and you were like, That's weird.
I will say the most common one that I always get people asking me for is a cheating clause. So people always say, well, do I get more money if he or she cheats on me? What happens in that instance? Can we put that in there? And my answer pretty much always is no. And the reason why is because it's very hard to define, what does cheating mean? Is it a physical affair? Is it an emotional affair? What do you actually have to do to trigger that clause? How deep do you want to get into this? And how are you going to prove it? And then what is the financial penalty if that happens? So that is definitely one that people ask all the time. And I say it's just a really, really hard clause to both draft and to enforce. So that's a really tough one.
Oh, that's good. What if you can't agree? Have you ever seen people come into a prenup negotiation and they're like, oh, wow, okay, don't like how you're handling this. Have you ever seen a prenup conversation go sideways?
So our goal as the lawyers is to not have that happen, but I would not be telling the truth if I didn't say that, yes, we have seen people not get married after having engaged us to start the prenup. There have been people who have stopped in the middle of the negotiation and not gotten married.
Yeah, no. And same thing with financial plans. We've actually seen people come into the process to start a financial plan together where we're helping them think about how to work as a team with their money and not make it through the process.
But at the end of the day, that's probably a better outcome. If it didn't work now and you weren't on the same page now, what would happen down the road? What would happen once you've already created this marital property or you had children together? Now you're coming back to our office for a divorce, which is far more expensive and much more unpleasant than the prenup.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, you've given us so much great intel. Thank you. All right, Ian, before I let you go, I have a little tradition I'm starting here, and I'd love you to help me kick it off. It's called Best Bite. I'm a big foodie, so here's how it works. Every guest will leave a food rec for the next guest. One dish or drink from any restaurant, doesn't have to be New York City. You won't know who you're recommending it to, though, so that makes it fun. Since you're our very first guest, I'm going to give you a rec today that you get to make one for our next guest. So if you had to pick one dish or drink from any restaurant for the next guest to try, what would it be? To give you a sec to think of yours, mine is, I had it about 2 months ago. I was in the West Village and I went to San Sabino, which is the Don Angie's sister restaurant, and stumbled in there super early because you really can't get in otherwise. Bartender recommended the steak Magazzino, which I was like, I'm a big meat eater, love a good steak, but she mentioned it was fried. And I was like, that just sounds weird. Let me try it anyway. And by far, my best bite of 2025 was the fried steak Magazzino from San Sabino.
I have been there and I've had their pasta with meatballs there, and it was out of this world. I think that restaurant is fantastic.
Yeah.
My best bite was last weekend, and I think this ties into a bit of what I do. Last weekend, my wife and I went to our favorite restaurant, which is Ruby Rosa on Mulberry Street. And while people go nuts for the tie-dye pizza, my best bite is the Ruby Rosa Supreme, which has pepperoni, mini meatballs, garlic. It is just an incredible bite. And I think there's some sentimentality to it because my wife and I got engaged at Ruby Rosa. And so that is always my best bite, and it just hits every single time.
Love that. So Ruby Rosa Supreme Pizza.
That's it.
Epic. That's such a good one. And I actually haven't had that. So now it's going on my list too.
Amazing.
Okay, so that'll be passed on to our next guest as your best bite. We'll see what they think. Thanks for being the first to play along. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. If people want to get in touch, how do they find you, Ian?
You can find me on our website at www.berkbot.com or on my LinkedIn at Ian Steinberg, and also on Instagram at Ian Steinberg Divorce Lawyer.
Amazing. Thank you. To everyone listening, we're building our following, so anything you can do to support means a lot. Please like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And if this episode made you think of someone who might benefit from it, please send it their way. Thank you for being here, Ian. Thank you for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The F Word with Priya Malani. If you like what you heard, hit subscribe wherever you're listening and leave us a review while you're at it. We're approval junkies. Don't forget, you can find a ton of great resources, content, courses, and other freebies at stashwealth.com. Now, for the capital S stuff our lawyers want us to say. Stash Wealth is a registered investment advisor. Content presented is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to make an offer or solicitation for any specific securities, product, service, or strategy. Consult with a qualified investment advisor, that's us, before implementing any strategy. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. There, we said it.
Did I have that up?